She prayed with one hand and strangled with the other. For decades, the Convent of the Sacred Heart was not a sanctuary. It was a slaughterhouse disguised in scripture. The desperate came seeking miracles, their bodies racked with disease, their souls heavy with sin. They knelt before Mother Celeste, the revered abbess with a saint's smile and a butcher's instincts. She pressed holy water to their foreheads with one hand, while the other tightened nooses of starvation, beatings, and slow, calculated torment. Behind the chapel's stained glass, the air smelled of incense and decay. The sick vanished into locked cells, their agonized whispers drowned out by hymns. The wealthy signed away fortunes, then were buried in unmarked graves, their names erased from ledgers and memory. Pilgrims called it a holy refuge. The dead knew better. This was a tomb where faith met famine and devotion meant death. Celeste Varga's descent into darkness began in the shadowed alleyways of 1890s Budapest, where she was born into a world of vice and violence. The illegitimate daughter of a brothel worker, her earliest memories were stained with the stench of cheap perfume and unwashed bodies, the sounds of drunken laughter mixing with muffled sobs. By the time she could walk, she had already learned to navigate the dangerous ecosystem of the brothel, dodging grasping hands, scavenging for scraps of food, and curling up in whatever corner offered a few hours of undisturbed sleep. Hunger was her constant companion, sharpening her instincts and hardening her heart. By the age of 8, Celeste had become a ghost in the brothel's underbelly, slipping unseen into rooms to pilfer coins from the pockets of unconscious patrons. She learned quickly that survival required more than stealth. It demanded cruelty. When the other children mocked her ragged clothes or hollow cheeks, she retaliated with calculated malice, once lacing a rival's bread with laxatives stolen from the madam's cabinet. The brothel, with its hierarchy of power and punishment, became her first classroom in manipulation. The madame, a woman as ruthless as she was shrewd, recognized Celeste's cunning and took her under her wing, teaching her the art of deception, how to feign innocence, how to exploit weakness, and, most importantly, how to wield fear as a weapon. Yet, for all her cunning, Celeste burned with resentment. She despised the clients who leered at her, the women who pitied her, and the world that had discarded her like refuse. By her teens, she had honed her hatred into a razor's edge. At 16, she orchestrated her first true act of vengeance, framing a particularly abusive client for theft and watching with cold satisfaction as the brothel's enforcers beat him bloody. It was then that she realized the intoxicating power of control over others' fates, over their pain. When she fled the brothel at 20, it was not for redemption, but for dominion. The convent, with its aura of purity and its vulnerable, trusting flock, presented the perfect stage for her ambitions. Armed with forged papers and a carefully crafted mask of piety, she stepped into her new role as a postulant, her hands folded in prayer, but her mind already plotting. The sisters saw only a penitent soul seeking salvation. They could not see the monster they had welcomed into their midst. The convent's infirmary reeked of candle wax and slow decay when Sister Margaretha, the oldest nun in the order, grasped Celeste's wrist with skeletal fingers. The dying woman's breath came in wet rasps as she whispered of a secret, gold coins hidden beneath the chapel's floorboards, a sacrilegious stash meant to see her through if she ever lost faith in her vows. Celeste's grip on the old nun's water cup tightened. Here was the proof she'd long suspected. Even the holiest were hypocrites. As Margarita's confession spilled forth between gasps, Celeste's gaze drifted to the spare pillow beside the sickbed. The candlelight painted, shifting shadows across the nun's sunken face, making her already gaunt features resemble a death mask. A fly buzzed against the infirmary window as Celeste weighed her options. Reporting the theft would earn her the abbess's favor, but the gold could buy more than favor. It could buy freedom, power, the kind of respect she'd been denied her whole life. Margarita coughed violently, flecking Celeste's wimple with blood. In that moment, Celeste realized the dying nun would never let her take the treasure, not without a fight, not without telling the others. The pillow was heavier than Celeste expected when she pressed it down. Margarita's legs thrashed beneath the rough wool blanket, her nails scrabbling at Celeste's arms. The struggle lasted only seconds, but to Celeste, time stretched like taffy. The muffled cries, the final twitch of limbs, the way the old nun's cloudy eyes seemed to fix on the crucifix above the bed, even as her soul departed. When stillness returned, Celeste methodically straightened the bedding, closed Margarita's staring eyes, and folded the nun's hands over her chest in a parody of peaceful repose. The next morning, when the sisters wept over Margarita's natural passing, Celeste joined their prayers with downcast eyes. That night, she pried up the loose floorboard near the third pew and found not just gold coins, but a leather pouch containing deeds to properties in the countryside. As she counted her stolen bounty by moonlight, Celeste discovered something far more valuable than wealth: the exhilarating knowledge that sin, when practiced with precision, carried no consequences. The path to her true vocation stretched clear before her. Why steal from the dying when she could orchestrate their deaths? In the wake of Margarita's death, Celeste moved through the convent like a shadow wrapped in sacred vestments. She had learned from the brothel that men, even holy men, saw what they wanted to see. When the bishop visited that Easter, she made sure to be kneeling in the chapel at all hours, her lips moving in silent prayer, the candlelight softening the sharp angles of her face into something beatific. She took special care with the infirmary patients now, dosing their pain with carefully measured tinctures, just enough to bring tears to their eyes when visitors came. "Sister Celeste has a healing touch," the bishop remarked to the Mother Superior, watching as she smoothed a damp cloth across a consumptive girl's forehead. What the bishop couldn't know was that the same hands that so tenderly adjusted a pillow had learned exactly how long to press down before resistance faded. That the herbal tinctures she administered with such care were sometimes laced with just enough nightshade to prolong suffering without causing immediate alarm. The consumptive girl, a merchant's daughter with no living relatives, would be dead within the month. After signing over her inheritance to the convent, of course, Celeste perfected the art of the pious performance. She took to wearing a small silver cross that caught the light when she moved, drawing the eye to her gestures of devotion. She trained her voice to quaver ever so slightly when speaking of the poor souls she'd failed to save, her lashes fluttering down as if to shield others from her grief. The other nuns began bringing visitors to her, wealthy widows seeking comfort, ailing nobles desperate for miracles. Each encounter followed the same script: the clasping of hands, the murmured assurances, the subtle probing for vulnerabilities. By winter, whispers of her gift had spread beyond the convent walls. Peasants left offerings at the gates for her blessings. The bishop spoke of recommending her for a position at a larger abbey where her talents could be better utilized. Only the dying saw through the facade, the way her comforting smile never reached her cold, assessing eyes, how her grip tightened just a fraction too much when helping them sip water. But by then, it was always too late. The convent cellar, where the sisters stored preserves for winter, began to house a different kind of bounty: locked chests of jewelry, stacks of signed deeds, and a growing ledger of names crossed out in careful, unshaking script. With her reputation as a pious healer firmly established, Celeste began perfecting her system of sanctified slaughter. The convent's ancient stone walls, which had once echoed with chanted prayers, now muffled screams behind the pretense of holy discipline. She started with the weakest, those whose disappearances would raise few questions. Ailing pilgrims who came seeking miracles found themselves confined to the dreaded penitent's cell, a claustrophobic chamber adjacent to the tuberculosis ward. There, under the guise of spiritual purification, Celeste would let disease and starvation do their slow work. The rules of her cruel regime were whispered among the trembling novices, bread and water once every 3 days, for the prideful, midnight flagellation, for the disobedient, and for those whose wealth she coveted most, a special punishment, being locked in the chapel's crypt overnight, where the damp chill seeped into lungs already ravaged by illness. The beatings were always administered with ritual precision. Celeste would select a heavy wooden cross from the sacristy, its edges sanded smooth by generations of devout hands, and deliver measured strikes to the soles of feet or across shoulder blades, places where bruises could be hidden by habits. "This is for your salvation," she'd murmur, her breath warm against the victim's ear as they sobbed. The other nuns, cowed by her supposed divine favor, turned away from the muffled cries, telling themselves it was God's will. For the particularly resistant, Celeste developed more creative torments. Wealthy widows who hesitated to sign over their estates would find themselves strapped to the chair of contemplation, a modified confessional where they could neither sit nor stand, their limbs cramping for hours until the documents were signed. The convent's once peaceful gardens now concealed shallow graves dug under cover of darkness, each new occupant listed in the parish records as having died in a state of grace. By the time winter's first frost painted the cloisters white, Celeste had transformed the house of God into something far more sinister, a factory of death where every prayer was a lie, every crucifix a weapon, and every passing bell tolled for another soul she'd sent heavenward. With a little earthly persuasion, Celeste's selection process was as meticulous as it was merciless. She moved through the convent's halls like a shadow in holy garb, her sharp eyes cataloging every vulnerability. The wealthy widows came first, grieving and gullible, their judgment clouded by loneliness and the promise of heavenly reunion with their departed husbands. They arrived draped in black lace and clutching rosaries, seeking solace in the convent's hallowed silence. Celeste would take their hands in hers, her voice dripping with honeyed sympathy as she spoke of eternal rest and spiritual cleansing. Within weeks, these women would be hollow-cheeked specters, signing away vineyards and townhouses in trembling script before being ushered into the TB ward, their coughs growing fainter with each passing day. Pilgrims were even easier prey, desperate peasants and ailing merchants, their bodies racked with consumption or wasting fevers, crawled to the convent gates like wounded animals seeking shelter. Celeste welcomed them with open arms and closed fists. Those who still had family were turned away with a sorrowful shake of her head. "Alas, we have no room." But the alone, the forgotten, the ones whose disappearances would raise no alarm, these she ushered inside with theatrical tenderness. Their healing treatments always began the same way: isolation in the dank cells beneath the chapel, where the only medicine was starvation, and the only prayer was the sound of their own weakening whimpers. Then there were the rebellious nuns, the ones who asked too many questions, who noticed the discrepancies in the cellar's stores, who dared to suggest that Sister Celeste's miracles smelled suspiciously like death. These were the most dangerous, and thus the most swiftly dealt with. A midnight summons to the abbess's chambers, a cup of penitent's tea, laced with enough belladonna to mimic divine rapture. By dawn, another sister would be called home to God, her body laid out in the chapel, with waxen hands folded over a chest that would never rise again. The remaining nuns would whisper of her piety, never noticing how her personal effects, a silver thimble, a cameo portrait, a deed to inherited farmland, mysteriously found their way into Celeste's growing collection. Celeste's most brilliant and most damning manipulation was her grand illusion of divine intervention. To the outside world, the Convent of the Sacred Heart became renowned for its inexplicable healings, where the lame walked and the dying rose from their beds, all under the watchful eye of the saintly Sister Celeste. Crowds gathered monthly to witness these miracles, never suspecting the dark truth. These were carefully staged performances, starring the very victims she had not yet broken. The recovered patients were always handpicked, those with enough spirit left to stand, but too terrified to disobey. Celeste would dose them with a potent mixture of opium and henbane, just enough to dull their pain and glaze their eyes with an otherworldly sheen. Dressed in clean white shifts, their hollow cheeks rouged to simulate health, they would be paraded before gasping onlookers. A consumptive girl who could barely breathe would suddenly find her voice to sing a hymn. A crippled old man, his legs withered from years of confinement in a cramped cell, would take his first steps with Celeste's supporting arm around him. Never mind that his agonized grimace was hidden by the crowd's tears of joy. Behind the scenes, the price for these performances was steep. Those selected for miracles knew the consequences of refusal: the return to starvation rations, the midnight beatings, the dreaded penance box, a coffin-sized wooden crate where disobedient inmates were sealed for days without light or air. And so they played their parts, their glassy-eyed smiles masking the slow rot within. The cruelest twist came after each performance. While pilgrims left donations and wept at the convent gates, the healed were marched back to their cells, their temporary reprieve over. The rouge was wiped away, revealing pallid skin stretched tight over bones. The clean shifts were exchanged for lice-ridden rags, and the opium's numbing embrace faded, leaving only the relentless ache of their untreated illnesses, and the knowledge that their suffering had been used to lure more victims into Celeste's web. The Widow Bailage case, a calculated corruption of hope. The day Widow Bailage arrived at the convent, her silk gloves clutched a handkerchief embroidered with her late husband's initials, a detail Celeste noted with predatory interest. The widow's fashionable mourning dress, though black like all the others, was tailored from Parisian wool, and the emerald brooch at her throat caught the light with every nervous tremor. "The doctors say it's a growth," the widow whispered over tea in the visitor's parlor, her fingers fluttering to her abdomen, where no tumor actually existed. Celeste had intercepted her medical reports weeks before through a bribed clerk. "They give me 6 months at most." Celeste's performance was masterful. She gasped softly, reaching across the lace tablecloth to grasp the widow's jeweled hands. "God has sent you to us just in time," she murmured, her voice thick with feigned emotion. She spoke of the convent's special waters from a hidden spring, of novenas that had shrunk tumors to nothing, carefully planting each lie like seeds in fertile soil. When the widow began weeping with desperate hope, Celeste made her move. "But such miracles require total devotion. You must stay with us as our guest to receive the full treatment." The transition from guest to prisoner happened gradually. First came the isolation, a private room far from other patients, to concentrate the healing energies. Then the dietary restrictions, only boiled roots and herbal tonics that left the widow weak and disoriented. Within weeks, the once elegant woman was shuffling through the halls in a stained nightdress, her hair matted, her eyes hollow. When Celeste finally presented the donation papers, the widow signed without protest, her trembling hand guided by a nun's firm grip. That night, as a storm rattled the convent windows, Celeste personally administered the widow's medicine, a tincture laced with enough arsenic to mimic a cancer's progression. As the widow thrashed in her final agonies, Celeste smoothed her hair and whispered, "Your suffering is over, my child," before methodically removing the emerald brooch from the woman's still warm throat. The next morning, the sisters would find her peacefully passed in her sleep, another miracle denied by God's inscrutable will. The moment Widow Bailage questioned her treatment, Celeste's beatific mask slipped. 2 burly novices dragged the shrieking woman down crumbling stone steps to the convent's ancient wine cellar, where rusted iron manacles hung from walls, still stained with the tannin of long-evaporated vintages. The widow's Parisian wool dress tore against the rough stones as they chained her right wrist to a damp wall, The left free, just enough mobility to sign documents, not enough to resist. For 3 endless months, the cellar's perpetual twilight became the widow's world. Each morning brought a single tin bowl of greasy broth, sometimes with maggots floating like punctuation marks, slid across the flagstones by a silent novice. The chains were just long enough to let her lap at it like a dog. Her once manicured nails clawed grooves into the soft mortar as she tracked time by the occasional shaft of light through a high barred window. The vinegar stench of her own waste mingled with the earthy rot of forgotten vintages in broken casks. Week 4 brought the first document. Celeste appeared in a shaft of lantern light, holding a deed to the Baylog vineyards between slender fingers. "Sign," she whispered, "and this ends today." When the widow spat at her, Celeste simply sighed and departed, leaving the parchment just beyond reach. The broth stopped coming. By week 6, the widow's ribs pressed against parchment-thin skin, like the staves of a broken barrel. Her whimpers echoed through the cellar's arches, blending with the scuttling of rats. When Celeste returned with a notary in tow, a corrupt little man who averted his eyes from the skeletal figure, the deed was signed with a trembling X, the widow's ruined hand guided by Celeste's firm grip. That night, they gave her clean water for the first time in months. As the widow gulped it greedily, she never noticed the bitter aftertaste of the belladonna tincture mixed within. By dawn, when the sisters discovered her body, the chains had been removed, and a beatific smile carefully arranged on her gaunt face. The death certificate would cite complications of stomach cancer, a final, perfect irony for the woman who never had cancer at all. As dawn's pale light crept through the convent's stained glass windows, Celeste orchestrated her most blasphemous performance yet. She arranged Widow Balog's emaciated corpse in a perfect tableau of holy rapture, kneeling at the prie-dieu in the chapel's most sacred alcove, the dead woman's skeletal hands clasped around a rosary that had never been hers in life. Celeste herself painted the faint blue veins beneath the waxen skin with watercolors, blending them into the morning light until the body appeared ethereal rather than starved. She placed a single drop of rose oil at each corner of the stiffened mouth to simulate the odor of sanctity that supposedly emanated from saints' bodies. The sisters gathered at Terce found the scene exactly as Celeste intended. The widow's head tilted heavenward, her sunken eyes rolled back in ecstatic surrender, the folds of her borrowed habit artfully draped to hide the chain bruises around her wrists. Novices wept at the sight, crossing themselves as Celeste described how the widow had begged to pray through the night for her healing. See how her soul left its earthly vessel at the very moment of divine union, Celeste murmured, pressing a reverent kiss to the corpse's forehead, while secretly checking that the tongue was properly positioned to hide bite marks from the final convulsions. She distributed fragments of the widow's robe as holy relics, knowing the fabric would disintegrate before anyone noticed the urine stains from the death throes. When the bishop arrived to investigate rumors of a miraculous death, Celeste presented him with the signed vineyard deed, a final gift from our most devoted penitent, and watched his skepticism melt before the prospect of such generous patronage. The death certificate, signed by a doctor deep in Celeste's debt, declared it a case of ecstasis mystica, with a discreet note about pre-existing heart conditions. By evening prayers, the widow's body rested in the convent crypt beneath a plaque proclaiming her holy surrender to God's embrace, her vineyards already producing their first harvest under new ownership. Sister Annika first noticed the discrepancy on a crisp autumn morning while inventorying the infirmary's supplies. The ledger clearly showed 12 vials of morphine delivered from the apothecary, yet only 8 remained in the locked cabinet. At first, she assumed her own counting error until she glimpsed Celeste slipping a vial into her sleeve that evening, her face eerily serene in the flickering candlelight. For weeks, Annika watched in silent horror as the convent's medicine dwindled while the graveyard expanded. The final straw came when young novice Livia, racked with pneumonia and begging for relief, was denied even a drop of laudanum. God's will demands suffering for purification, Celeste had proclaimed, stroking the girl's fevered brow with one hand while the other clutched a full syringe behind her back. That night, Annika made her fatal mistake. She cornered Celeste in the sacristy, her voice trembling with righteous anger. "The morphine. I've seen you take it. Those patients needed." Celeste's response was a spider's smile. "Come, sister, let us pray together for your troubled spirit." Her grip on Annika's elbow was steel beneath velvet as she led her toward the dreaded Chapel of Penitence, where the walls were thick, the floors stained with old blood, and no one ever heard screams. The Chapel of Penitence smelled of beeswax and iron that night. As Celeste methodically wound the heavy onyx rosary around her fist, the silver crucifix between her knuckles, catching candlelight like a blade, Sister Annika knelt at the altar rail, not in prayer, but because the novice sisters had forced her there, their faces pale as they gripped her shoulders. "This will cleanse your rebellious spirit," Celeste whispered, her breath warm against Annika's ear as she gathered the nun's habit in one hand, exposing the thin shift beneath. The first strike landed with a crack that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, the crucifix embedding itself in the flesh between Annika's shoulder blades. By the fifth blow, blood speckled the rosary beads like macabre decoration. Annika's screams turned wet when the silver cross fractured her ribs. Celeste timed each swing to the rhythm of the Miserere she hummed under her breath. The other nuns watched in paralyzed horror as their abbess transformed before them, her wimple askew, her face glistening with sweat and fervor, the rosary now a weapon consecrated in blood. When Annika collapsed forward, her broken ribs puncturing her lungs, Celeste pressed the blood-slicked crucifix to the dying nun's lips. "Kiss your salvation," she commanded. Annika's final act of defiance was to spit a tooth onto the altar steps. At dawn, they found Sister Annika in pious repose before the Virgin statue, her hands folded around an unbroken rosary, the real one hidden in Celeste's iron-bound chest of secrets, its beads forever stained burgundy. The death certificate cited sudden hemoptysis from tuberculosis. Only novice Livia noticed the strange dents in the altar rail that matched a crucifix's shape, and the way the cleaning rags that night reeked of lye and copper. As Annika's body cooled on the chapel stones, Celeste sprang into action with the precision of a stage director. She dragged the corpse to the spiral staircase leading to the choir loft, its jagged edges notorious among the nuns for catching habits. With practiced hands, she arranged Annika's limbs at unnatural angles, snapping the wrist backward to mimic impact trauma. A well-placed shove sent the body tumbling down the uneven steps, the thuds echoing through the empty chapel like a grotesque parody of falling dominoes. At the bottom, Celeste performed her macabre pantomime. She splashed holy water from a nearby stoup across Annika's forehead to bless her final moments, while simultaneously using the damp cloth to wipe telltale blood spatter from the walls. She scattered broken beads from a cheap rosary around the scene, planting the narrative of a stumble during nighttime prayers. Most ingeniously, she took Annika's own slippers and scuffed their soles against the worn third step, the one everyone knew was loose, transferring just enough sawdust to the leather to sell the illusion. When the sisters came running at her screams, they found Celeste cradling Annika's head in her lap, her wimples streaked with artfully applied dust. "I tried to catch her," she sobbed, pointing to the suspiciously pristine scratch marks on her own arms, self-inflicted with a penitent Silas just moments before. The attending physician, already indebted to Celeste for covering up his own indiscretions, pronounced it a tragic accident before even examining the body. By vespers, the nuns were whispering about Annika's clumsy devotion, while the real rosary, its chain stretched from strangulation, its crucifix bent from impact with bone, sat hidden in the abbess' strongbox, another holy relic perverted into a murder weapon. Old Tomasz had been delivering bread to the Convent of the Sacred Heart for 20 years, his cart creaking up the hill every Tuesday with the same order: 12 loaves for the nuns, 6 for the novices, and 3 sweet brioches for the visiting bishop's monthly tea. But in the autumn of 1951, his practiced eye noticed something amiss. The sisters now took only 8 plain loaves each week, though their ranks supposedly swelled with new postulants. More troubling were the irregular requests: 24 hard rye loaves for the poor. Yet Tomasz never saw beggars at the gates, only the convent's waste pit, where moldering crusts lay untouched beside broken medicine vials. The final clue came in December, when Sister Josefa, her hands shaking beneath her sleeves, ordered 50 communion wafers for a special retreat. That night, Tomasz lay awake, his flour-dusted ledger open on the kitchen table, doing sums that refused to balance. 8 nuns couldn't possibly need 50 wafers, unless they weren't for the living. At dawn, he brought his records to Father André at St. Michael's, the ink-stained pages trembling in his grip. "Either their sisters aren't eating," he whispered, "or they're feeding more mouths than they're telling." The priest's face turned ashen when Tomasz pointed to the most damning column: the weeks when no bread was ordered at all. Yet smoke still rose from the convent's ovens. Someone was baking in secret. And flour wasn't the only thing disappearing into that ancient stone building. The rats came first. Eva Kovacs heard them skittering across the damp cellar stones for weeks before the first bite came in the darkness, a sharp pain at her pinky finger as she slept chained to the wall. By the time moonlight pierced the high barred window each night, she could trace their roots by the scabs on her arms, the missing nails where hungry teeth had found purchase. On the night of the winter solstice, she knew because the moon cast its longest silver blade across the floor. Eva made her desperate bargain. She let the largest rat gnaw through the rotting flesh of her left ring finger, biting her own lips bloody to stay silent as tiny bones crunched between rodent teeth. When the chain slipped free from her mutilated hand, she crawled toward the moonlight like a wounded animal, her remaining fingers leaving smears of pus and blood on the stones. The barred window was too high, so Eva stacked the bones of previous occupants, femurs as ladders, skulls as stepping stones, until she could hook her ravaged hands through the grate. When her weight shattered the rusted iron, she tumbled into the convent's herb garden, her body landing among the poisonous belladonna plants Celeste cultivated for medicinal purposes. Dawn found Eva at the village well, her tattered shift stiff with frozen blood, holding up her skeletal hands like evidence from a nightmare. The baker's son screamed when he saw the bite marks, some rodent, some unmistakably human, where she'd chewed through her own tendons to escape the chains. As the villagers gathered, Eva whispered 2 words that would echo through the trial to come: the cellar. When gendarmes stormed the convent cellar, with Eva Kovacs' gnawed hand pointing the way, they expected filth and chains, not the meticulous archive of greed they discovered behind a false wall. Stacked in cedar-lined compartments, normally used for preserving sacramental wine, 52 wills fluttered like the wings of trapped moths as the officers pulled them into the light. Each bore the same hallmarks of coercion: shaky signatures from hands weakened by starvation, alterations in Celeste's distinctive ink, and the overwhelming stench of desperation. Chief Inspector Lazar sorted them into piles on the cellar's blood-stained floor, one for vineyards, another for townhouses, a particularly thick stack for jewelry collections. The most damning were the final gifts signed in the last hours of life, like Widow Balog's vineyard deed, with its X mark barely clearing the notary's forged witness line. A brittle parchment from 1947 contained Sister Annika's family olive groves, signed the day before her fall. But it was the newest will that made Lazar's hands tremble, a document leaving novice Livia's substantial dowry to the convent, dated yesterday in fresh ink, though the girl still lived upstairs, quarantined with fever. As rain drummed on the cellar grate, the same bars Eva had shattered with her bone ladder, the inspector noted how each will bore identical phrasing. Being of sound mind. The bitter laugh that escaped him echoed through the cavernous dark. Sound minds didn't sign away fortunes while chained in filth. Sound bodies didn't end up buried beneath belladonna bushes. And no godly institution needed 52 secret wills stacked like firewood next to a torture chamber. The raid came on the coldest night of 1955, when the convent's stones groaned with frost and the wind howled like the damned through its cloisters. At precisely 3:17 a.m., 30 armed gendarmes, many clutching rosaries beneath their uniforms, burst through the oak doors with axes, their lanterns throwing hellish shadows across the chapel walls. They found Celeste, as she'd always threatened to be found, kneeling at the high altar in full vestments, the emerald crucifix from Widow Balog's brooch clutched in hands that gleamed with consecrated oil. The air reeked of burning hair and myrrh. As boots pounded up the nave, she didn't turn, but her whisper carried like a funeral bell, "You come too late." Then, chaos. With a scream that shattered the stained glass martyr windows, Celeste launched herself at the intruders, the emerald crucifix becoming a dagger in her grip. She moved with unnatural speed, dousing lanterns with holy water that blinded 2 officers, later found to be laced with quicklime, scattering burning altar candles that set novices' habits aflame. When Sergeant Cosma tried to restrain her, she drove the crucifix deep into his shoulder, screaming verses from the Book of Judith. "The Lord hath struck him by the hand of a woman." It took 6 men to pin her to the very flagstones where Sister Annika had died. As they wrenched her arms behind her back, the abbess's wimple tore away, revealing hair matted with blood, not her own. Novice Livia, watching from the bell tower, began pulling the death knell with such force that the rope seared her palms to the bone, the tolling echoing over the frozen countryside like God's own judgment. The trial that shook a nation. 1956 to 1957. A circus of saints and sinners. The Budapest courthouse transformed into a macabre theater where justice and fanaticism waged war for 14 grueling months. Each morning, Celeste made her grand entrance like some perverse bride of Christ, her manacled wrists draped in lace, stolen from a dead novice's trousseau, singing the Te Deum in a voice that still made jurors cross themselves. The survivors who testified against her became living relics of her cruelty. Eva Kovacs, raising her rat-gnawed hands like unholy stigmata. The baker Tomasz's flour-stained ledger pages fluttering as he recounted missing loaves. The forensic expert's chalk outline of Sister Annika's fall, revealing telltale drag marks on the chapel's stairs. When the prosecutor unsealed the 52 wills, their parchment crackling like dry bones, Celeste's laughter shattered the courtroom's solemnity. "The gospel commands charity, does it not?" she purred, tracing a blood stain on Widow Balog's vineyard deed, with a fingernail filed sharp as a quill. Her devotees in the gallery, pale women in hair shirts that left rust-colored streaks on the oak benches, began rocking and keening, hurling vials that shattered against the judge's bench, releasing the familiar sweet rot scent of her signature belladonna tincture. But it was novice Livia's testimony that broke the spectacle into raw horror. The girl, now a skeletal woman of 19, her lungs ruined by Celeste's treatments, leaned toward the microphone and whispered how the abbess had pressed a pen between her septic fingers during fever delirium. As Livia gasped through her ruined lungs, imitating Celeste's honeyed threat, "Sign or I'll let the rats finish what they started with Eva," the abbess surged against her restraints, spraying spittle and Psalm 109 like curses. The bailiffs had to tackle her as she screamed prophecies of stillbirths and burning churches, her emerald crucifix carving a gash in the prosecutor's cheek that would later fester mysteriously. November 8, 1957, the verdict came: life imprisonment. As they led her away, Celeste paused to kiss her emerald crucifix, now crusted with Sergeant Cosma's blood, and locked eyes with each survivor in turn. She died 5 years later in Pancrac Prison, found kneeling on the cell floor in perfect prayer posture. The guards swore her lips still moved, whispering psalms, but the prison doctor noted 3 chilling details. Her fingers were frozen around a crumpled list, matching all missing victims. The emerald crucifix had vanished from evidence. The cell smelled distinctly of belladonna, though none grew within miles. On the morning of her death, the convent's ruins, burned by villagers in '56, were found blanketed in black roses, a variety last seen in Widow Baylog's vineyards. Evil wears many faces. Which one will we fail to recognize next? Subscribe for our investigation into the Doctor of Death's door, where the white coat hid even darker secrets. The final tally of Celeste's victims reads like a census of the damned. Over 200 souls, erased between the convent's hallowed walls, their names etched only in the cellar's ledger and the shallow graves beneath the belladonna bushes. Yet the true horror lies in how long the slaughter continued unchecked. For 30 years, whispered reports of unusual deaths and miraculous inheritances were dismissed by church authorities, their investigations ending where the convent's gold-lined coffers began. A 1943 bishop's memo, unearthed decades later, coldly noted, "The Matthewite nuns' zealous care for the sick may appear extreme, but their donations rebuild our dioceses." The ultimate irony came in 1965 when the derelict convent was consecrated anew as the Fa Saint Dymphna Psychiatric Hospital. To this day, orderlies report unsettling phenomena: the scent of incense in locked wards, phantom footsteps echoing through the old cellar, and, most chillingly, patients who swear they're treated at night by a veiled sister with emerald eyes. These patients, many unaware of the building's history, describe identical details: ice-cold fingers during bedside checks, whispered Latin psalms, and an overwhelming urge to sign things in their medicated haze. In 2018, a janitor restoring the original chapel uncovered a hollow space behind the altar. Inside lay a single rotted wimple, its lace stiff with crystallized belladonna, and 52 rusted keys labeled in peeling ink. Each fit the locks of long-destroyed storage trunks where victims' possessions were kept. The hospital director ordered the find sealed away, but not before 3 staff members quit, claiming the keys jangled by themselves at night. Now, as historians debate whether to memorialize the dead, the church quietly pays survivors' medical bills, a pittance of repentance for generations of complicit silence. The only monument stands unintentional: the hospital's lush gardens, where the belladonna bushes still bloom with unnatural vigor, their berries black as a nun's habit in moonlight. Old Chapel stood. On-screen timestamp flickers, then displays, December 4th, 1955. Some horrors refuse to stay buried. Click the bell icon to uncover why this footage was almost destroyed, and who still wants it hidden. To this day, the whereabouts of Celeste's stolen fortune remain one of Europe's most tantalizing mysteries. Some claim the gold still lies hidden beneath the ruins of the convent's chapel, sealed behind walls where desperate scratching marks were found during the hospital's renovation. Others whisper that it was used to buy the silence of church officials. After the trial, 3 bishops abruptly retired to luxurious villas in Tuscany, while the lead prosecutor's daughter received an inexplicable charitable donation that funded her medical education. The most chilling theory comes from the hospital's night staff, who report hearing ghostly counting in the old cellar, clinking coins, rustling bills, and always stopping at 52. But the true horror lies in the unanswered question: how many more Celestes walk among us? How many shepherds of the flock secretly sharpen their teeth on the vulnerable? The church never released its full investigation, and archives from that era remains suspiciously incomplete. As you walk past a convent or church today, look closely at the faces of the faithful. Notice the ones who smile a little too beatifically, who clutch their rosaries a little too tightly, and ask yourself, whose gold gilds their altars? Whose silence keeps their secrets? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking true crime stories from around the world. Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant. This is Crime Tales Across Times, signing off. If you found this story disturbing, wait until you hear about the Orphanage of the Forgotten Sisters, where the holy women weren't stealing gold, they were stealing children. Click the notification bell to be the first to hear this chilling tale.